Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and welcome to my newest video for list season. And this is actually going to be my last video for the music portion of my list season at least. And today I'm going to be talking about my top 20 favorite albums of 2020. This is obviously the list where I'm going to talk about what my personal favorite albums of the year were. These aren't the objective best or anything like that, but they are the albums that I consider to be the best of what was released this year. The albums that impacted me the most, the ones that affected me the most, the ones that absolutely resonated with me the most. But let's not waste any more time and let's get started. Let's go ahead and get started at number 20. Code Orange's album Underneath was not necessarily a release that resonated with me the first couple of times I heard it. I was a little put off by the very loud glitchy electronic effects, and the clean vocalist wasn't necessarily for me, at least on first listens, but the more I got into this album, the more it really started clicking with me, and eventually it started clicking with me so much that I started really getting the point of this album. This is one of the most innovative metalcore albums I've heard in recent memory. It does a lot of interesting things with the genre that I don't think many other metalcore artists have been taking risks to do or haven't really been taking the initiative to do. This one delves into combining huge electronics with these pummeling guitar riffs, and the way they do it is very interesting to me. It creates a very distinctive atmosphere that belongs to basically this album entirely. That's what started to become a charm of this album for me, was how unsettling these electronic effects made everything feel. It made the album feel very off-kilter and very odd, which sort of works for the very unsettling atmosphere that Code Orange is trying to do. There's a lot of great songs on this album, and A Sliver is obviously my favorite. If you've seen my top 50 best songs of 2020, you know that. I love how it has this more laid-back vibe for a lot of the song, but then it suddenly just starts getting more and more intense, and the atmosphere keeps building and building until there's this huge electronic breakdown that gets me every time. And then there's Swallowing the Rabbit Hole, which is most certainly the most wild song on the album, with how it uses its electronic effects especially. Code Orange definitely made a very interesting release that I think will be a defining moment for their career, so this is one that I think they're going to pursue this sound further and they're going to do new things with it, so I am very excited to see where they go in the future. This is a great album, and I am glad it made my list.
Why do all the monsters come out at night? Why do we sleep when we want to hide? Why do
After the incredibly disappointing Last Young Renegade, I was really worried that All Time Low were going down a path where they wouldn't be able to get back to the sound they were once known and loved for, but they more than proved me wrong with Wake Up Sunshine, and man am I glad they did. If you watched my All Time Low ranked video earlier this year, I actually put this album at number 3 on my list in my top 3 All Time Low albums, and I think after hearing this album so many times this year, I would still put it there. All Time Low really refined their sound here in a way that was really cool and really interesting to listen to, and they brought in the good elements of Last Young Renegade and made them even better. In 14 tracks, this album rarely ever gets boring and stays along its very catchy path for the majority of the time. There's great song after great song here. Sleeping In is still a song that I can just have so much fun to, with its incessantly catchy guitar riff and that chorus that just never fails to lift you off your feet. Safe is of course my favorite off the album. I love the 80s vibe that the song has, and that chorus just feels destined for a summer drive. And Melancholy Kaleidoscope is one of All Time Low's best written songs to date by far. All Time Low made the seminal summer album, and if this is the direction they're going down for the future, I certainly hope it is, because this is what they're good at, making these songs that are very well written and very layered and have a lot of interesting qualities to them. So good on you, All Time Low, for coming back stronger than ever.
now you're saying I'm acting crazy, and you don't see what you see. Get back to where you used.
I remember hearing so many Neon Trees songs back in the day, especially that song Everybody Talks, which was just such a huge hit back in the early 2010s, and deservedly so in my opinion, so I was very interested to see what they would do after coming back after a very long hiatus, and I Can Feel You Forgetting Me is not a disappointing return at all. In fact, this is an excellent album that only served to grow on me as the year went on. In fact, out of all the albums I've listened to this year, I'd say this is the one that grew on me the most. The more I listened to the album, the more I realized there were actually some really interesting layers to it, and the more the catchiness just really got to me, especially on songs like Used to Like, which just, I still think is the catchiest song of the year by far. That chorus just gets to me every time. And the lead vocalist, you can just tell he's having a fun time on tracks like these. The album goes off on a bang with the song Nights. It kicks the door down. It's a barn burner. And it is just a primary example, in my opinion, of how to do pop right. This album is admittedly pretty cynical about relationships and about living in this digital age of relationships, but it doesn't necessarily frame it in the most negative light possible. Instead, I feel like the lead singer is more talking about how digital relationships have been a negative for himself, and because of that, the album becomes a more personal listen as opposed to a more universal one, which I think is what works about it, as opposed to other songs that critique relationships in the digital age. This one is a more personal journey. You can see this in songs like Living Single or Skeleton Boy, where it seems more that he is the one that is experiencing these problems himself. Not that it's the digital age of relationships that's causing these problems, it's more that living in the digital age has heightened the relationship problems for him, which I think is a really interesting idea. This is a really interesting album that shows its layers subtly, but really does a good job at showing them and at revealing them in interesting ways all the same.
What the dead men say, it's just between us. What the dead men say, you can't.
While I don't quite love What the Dead Men Say as much as I did when I first heard it, I still do think this is a really good album by Trivium. It's not as good as The Sin and the Sins, but it would be hard to match up to an album like that, which I think is one of Trivium's best. This album is still a great crowd pleaser, and something that I think will please almost any Trivium fan, which is exactly what the band likes to do, and I think they prove that in spades here. You can see evidence of Trivium's crowd-pleasing tactics, with their songs having fun guitar riff after fun guitar riff, but also boasting the incredibly interesting lyrics that they've always had in the past. You can see this on a song like Amongst the Shadows and the Stones, which has some of the most angry political fury that the band has ever expressed. Matt Heffy really goes off in this song, screaming his heart out. You can feel his passion, you can feel his fury. And then you've got a song like Catastrophist, where Matt Heffy almost seems to be expressing a sorrow at a betrayal, and this betrayal has seemed to really affect him because the song goes into great detail about it, and it's just really interesting to listen to. And that chorus, man, it's just absolutely irresistible. And then, of course, you've got the more fun songs like The Defiant, which is essentially about overcoming obstacles and standing up against those who would try to bring you down, but Trivium does it in a way that is more creative than bands like them. What the Dead Men Say is, quite simply, a great metal album with a lot of talent in it. I still say that the drummer brings a lot to this band, and I hope they don't get rid of him anytime soon because he brings so much intensity to the table, along with the rest of the very talented band members here. Trivium continue to be one of the great metal bands, and they're one of the ones that have lasted the longest, and deservedly so. I can't wait to see what they do next.
I spent the whole day in my head. Do a little spring cleaning. I'm always too busy dreaming.
Mac Miller really did go too soon. It was tragic to see him pass back in 2018, and his passing affected so many people. Like I said in my top 50 best songs of 2020, I didn't really ever get into this artist, but after hearing Circles, I know that I need to get into his previous discography because this album is just great. It has such a good R&B/electronic vibe that I absolutely loved. It's a very deeply realized album that I think flows very well from beginning to end. And there's so many great moments here. Blue World is my favorite by far, with this just immaculate beat that I absolutely adore, and that immediately told me with that beat that this song was going to be one of my favorite songs of the year, and it most certainly was. But then you've also got other even deeper and more vulnerable tracks like Woods and Good News. Good News in particular was very brutal to me in what it talked about and the different lyrical aspects of Mac Miller's life that it highlighted. When you look into the song, it's sort of a heartbreaking listen. And Woods is just a very peaceful song that I absolutely loved hearing. This is one of the few posthumous albums that I think actually respects the artist. And that's because the record label actually did a good job at distributing it, and it sounds like his family even approved of it, so the album actually feels well realized in that regard, and I'm very thankful for that. Rest in peace, Mac Miller.
So tell me, was it worth it? Even if you hurt it, I give it into all.
The Word Alive made their best work since Deceiver with Monomania. This album, while not nearly as intense as Deceiver, and maybe not even my favorite Word Alive album, it might come in number 2, but it's very hard to say at this point. Monomania has continued to resonate with me throughout the whole year. There are many reasons for that. I think on this album, the Word Alive finally found their best synthesis of the new sound they've been going for since around Dark Matter. That sound of combining electronics with rock and metalcore flares. And here, I think they nail it in a lot of ways. The title track is a primary example of this, where Tell Smith lets his vocals go to new heights in the wonderful chorus, and he lets his lyrics go to new heights as well. And then, of course, you've got a song like No Way Out, which is just relentlessly catchy, and has one of the best choruses that the Word Alive has penned to date. And then you've got a song like Comfort and Chaos, which is just heartbreaking to listen to as you're seeing Tell Smith analyze this idea of safety and of if it's ever possible to have safety in a world that is so broken and so desolate. And the album does even end out optimistically, saying that death is not the end, that we are still remembered beyond that, that our legacy will live on in one way or the other, which I really love as a sort of contradiction to the opening track. It sort of takes what the opening track said, the insecurities of that track, and answers it with, well, maybe we won't always be there. Maybe we won't always be remembered in the way we would want to, but there will still be a legacy left behind in some way. And I really liked that message. Thanks to an online friend of mine, I got into Brothers of Metal big time this year, and man am I so glad I did. When I first heard what they were, it didn't seem like it'd quite be the thing for me. Viking metal, it just sounded ridiculous. And when I delved into the album, it was ridiculous, but in the most fun way possible. This band knows what they are, and because of that, they have so much fun with it. But even in the midst of some sort of silly lyrics like on the song Njord, which is really just a chant-along song that is ridiculous fun to listen to, you also do have songs that are legitimately inspiring. I think of the track Connaz de Gaz, which, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but the chorus of that song legitimately got to me. You feel the enthusiasm of the band along with you, and still that beginning guitar riff in the song, that beginning guitar melody, never fails to get me hyped. It is one of the most fun guitar lines I've heard all year. And then you've got, of course, the fun songs like Chainbreaker, which is probably the most intense song on the album, but is just ridiculously enjoyable to listen to. And there's even a great ballad on here in Weaver of Fate that does a good job at slowing the pace of the album for a brief time before we go back into the intensity with Njord and the title track and Brothers Unite. And then, of course, there's the ending track, which is just absolutely victorious. To the Skies and Beyond is wonderful and leaves the album out on a very memorable note. I can't believe I enjoyed this band, but now I see that I've been missing out, and I absolutely love what they're doing. Bring on more Viking metal, I suppose.
It's worse, 'cause
Nothing But Thieves came back in a big way with Moral Panic. After their great album, Broken Machine, I wasn't sure if they could top themselves, and even though they didn't quite do that with Moral Panic, they still released an album that I think is an excellent follow-up. This album does a great job at defining what its album's title is, essentially having panics or anxieties about different things in life, whether they're more personal or whether they're more universal. And I like how the album gets more and more universal, but also more and more personal as the album goes on. And it's interesting how they navigate the contradictions of those two things. especially in a song like Can You Afford to Be an Individual, where they talk about the state of American politics in a way that does feel very universal, but also targets the individual in a very uncomfortable way, saying that what if you're the bad person? What if your views are the wrong ones? For the longest time, that one was my favorite on the album, but Phobia ended up eventually winning out for me. I just love the whispered vocals that Connor Mason has in a sort of Billie Eilish style that is very interesting. But the song continues to switch up genres in its runtime, and it's really cool to see it become more and more intense as it goes on until it's becoming absolutely chaotic in its ending moments. But it wouldn't be a Nothing But Thieves album without the very deep and personal moments, would it? Free If We Want It is a clear, great example of that, with just a beautiful chorus that shows Connor Mason's vocals in an even better light than ever before. I absolutely love the inspiration that the songs has in the midst of a pretty cynical album. And then, of course, the album's ending track talks about death and moving on in a very touching way that I think goes understated. Moral Panic from front to back is a pretty great album and shows that Nothing But Thieves are not even close to being done with innovating in the rock sphere, and I am so glad for that.
And they said, there goes the last great American dynasty.
Yep, Taylor Swift is on a best albums list for me, and for the first time ever. But I think she does in fact deserve it. Like I said many times now, I do think that I was a little harsh to her, especially in my younger years, because folklore shows that there has been artistic potential in Taylor Swift all along, and I feel like this is the album where she's really showing it to its fullest extent. This is a wonderful album, full of beautiful folk melodies and beautiful pop melodies as well, and the two genres synthesize together super well in many moments on the album. Exile is a perfect example of this, with just a beautiful harmony between Taylor Swift and Bon Iver that still never fails to bring chills up my spine as it talks about a breakup in two different perspectives. Folklore was a perfect name for this album. It was a perfect title for it because this album, more than anything, is about stories. And not every story here always relates to Swift herself. Sometimes she's greatly exaggerating things, sometimes she's even speaking in the perspective of other people, which I think is very interesting. The Last Great American Dynasty is a great example of this, where Taylor Swift is speaking in the perspective of another woman whose house she eventually bought. It's really intriguing to hear, and is probably one of Taylor Swift's most intricately written moments on any album she's ever done. But of course, you've also got songs that are inherently about relationships. And those songs aren't horrible here either. August is a great example of this, as one of the most beautiful sounding songs on the album. And then you've got Betty, which just has some gorgeous harmonica and bluegrass arrangements within the song that I absolutely loved. This album is a great example of something that I consistently hold myself accountable for as a music critic. I will give an artist credit whenever credit is due. The credit is most certainly due here. This is a great album from Swift, and Evermore was a great sequel to it. So, let's see what Swift does next. Boston Manor abandoned any pretensions of pop-punk on glue and instead went full-on for the punk rock on this album, and I absolutely love them for it. This is an excellent release, and in my opinion, it is their best album to date, even though I did love the drenched, dark atmosphere of Welcome to the Neighborhood. I think Glue works on a totally different level as it taps into this raw intensity, and it works so well in nearly every moment on this album. Liquid is an eerie song which delves into a deep atmosphere in a way that Boston Manor has never done before. There's just wonderfully intense song after wonderfully intense song here, with songs working so well in what they're trying to do, like You, Me, and the Class War, expressing this rage about an abusive relationship in a way that only Boston Manor could do, as they keep on saying, with more and more rage, the same love. This is a class war, and it feels like an instantly iconic line. But then you've got the vulnerable moments on this album, like On a High Ledge, where Henry Cox is detailing this time when he contemplated taking a jump and ultimately taking his own life. And it's a really tragic listen, but ultimately a very important one, especially for those who are dealing with mental health issues. and Stuck in the Mud continues that, and even pays tribute to Linkin Park in a way that I really loved. This is an excellent rock album, an excellent punk rock album, and I just continue to be impressed by what Boston Manor are doing for the punk rock genre, and I hope they continue innovating like this for the near future. Progressive metal is not typically a genre that I listen to, but I feel like bands like Haken show me that I definitely need to get more into the genre and pay more attention to it. Virus is an excellent album from a great band. Haken is not exactly what I expected them to be, especially in terms of lead vocals. The lead vocalist is not exactly someone you would expect to be fronting a prog metal band, but that's what makes this band unique in a way. You can immediately tell on a barn burner-like prosthetic that this band just has an undeniable flair for the dramatics and a flair for going all out in terms of intensity, and that's what really drew me to them right away. But they also know how to keep a song intriguing for a long runtime and do a lot of interesting stuff within the runtime that they have. Carousel is a clear example of this, running almost 11 minutes long, but never once overstaying its welcome and having a lot of interesting progressions in it. But I think Invasion is probably the best example of what this band is capable of. You can really see everyone firing on all cylinders in the song as they're describing in eerie detail a metaphorical virus coming to infect everyone. But of course, when you really see the band at their most talented, when you really see the full potential of them come alive, is on the insane 5-track run that is Messiah Complex. Man, talk about a wonderful 5-track, 17-minute suite that never fails to sweep me off my feet with what it does. This is an insanely good metal album that I just loved listening to, and the progressive elements of it only made it work more for me. I am definitely delving more into this band in the future, and I definitely am interested to see what their story will continue to be.
You wrote me a letter, but I don't have to read it.
Phoebe Bridgers' album Punisher is the other album that grew on me a lot. Even though it didn't have quite the same rate of growth for me as I Can Feel You Forgetting Me by Neon Trees, this album still it crept up on me in a very interesting way. I always knew that this album was going to end up in my top 20, but at first I didn't realize it was going to end up quite this high. But the more I heard it, the more I realized this album really was resonating with me, and it was going to be in my top 10. Phoebe Bridgers creates a musical atmosphere that is just so very appropriate for this year, and I don't think it was entirely intentional for her to do that, because this album was probably written before the pandemic happened, but this album felt very much so appropriate for this time and this year, as this album creates a very dark, brooding atmosphere where Phoebe's vocals can take center stage and she can contemplate about a lot of different things about herself and about the world in general. And I love her for it. I love what she's doing here. I Know the End still brings tears to my eyes as it just does a great job at painting this epic apocalyptic landscape, but looking at it with a sense of sarcasm, a sense of irony, but also a sense of hope. And it's really interesting to hear what she does in this song. There's so many other wonderful tracks here too, like Graceland 2, which has a sort of bluegrass sound to it that is just really endearing to me, just really gorgeous, and something that works very well for this album, even in the midst of the sort of emo alternative atmosphere that this album is trying to have. The lyricism on this album is great throughout, as is evidenced on a song like Chinese Satellite, where Phoebe Bridgers talks about faith in a very interesting way to me. This album through and through is just really consistent. That's mainly what I can say about it. It keeps its atmosphere very well, and Phoebe Bridgers is just really confident here as a lyricist, as a singer, pretty much in every aspect. This is a wonderful album that I am so glad I continue to return to and continue to give chances to, because it more than deserves a spot in my top 10.
In your eyes, I see there's something burning inside you. Oh, inside.
I haven't really been a big fan of The Weeknd's personality in the past. I always felt it was a little bit too arrogant and too just over the top for me. but I think The Weeknd finally finds where his personality works the best on After Hours, and that is when he frames his personality in a way to where he's saying, you should not be attracted to this personality. This is not something you should be following after. This is not a good person. And he paints that in a great way. After Hours puts The Weeknd in the setting of Las Vegas, which is pretty much perfect for his very cynical, debauched character, and Las Vegas is very much so framed as an area of debauchery as well. And while you do see the Weeknd persona pop up a lot on this album, I also do think you see Abel as a person pop up several times in this album as well, such as on a track like Escape from LA. But where this album really shines is when it goes full-on, head-on into its 80s vibes. On a song like Blinding Lights, this is an obvious example. I've already talked about this song at length, but just to know, it's still a wonderful song and is one of my favorites of the year, and I just love the beginning synth line. And then of course you've got a song like In Your Eyes, which has an irresistible saxophone solo that I just absolutely love, and Faith as well just has the great 80s vibes and an immaculate production value behind it. After Hours, I think, is The Weeknd at his most confident and his most poignant, and I just really enjoyed this album. It was one that was irresistible to me, and it just nailed its vibe perfectly. Great job, The Weeknd. I am very disappointed that you didn't get a Grammy nomination for this. You deserved better.
Am I addicted to the misery? Is this how I'll always be? Crying this song into everyone.
Polaris' album, The Death of Me, was one that pretty much resonated with me from the first time I heard it. Every song on here hit me pretty well in a pretty interesting way, and I think this album is just one of the most consistent metalcore albums of the year. You can tell the talent of this band, as they're just doing so much good work here in terms of making metalcore sound interesting and innovative. Vagabond is a great example of this, with a chorus that I just absolutely adore, and guitar work that reminds me of Era, which is of course a huge compliment from me. But you've also got songs here that are sort of classic metalcore, but also feel a lot more interesting than other metalcore tracks released this year, like Masochist, which has a chorus that is just insanely good, but also sees the band delving into very personal and very deeply relevant topics. Polaris are a band that is proof that it's going to be the new bands that are going to make metalcore interesting again, and I hope that we continue to pay attention to bands like them, because they deserve to have recognition. I'm so glad this album got so much praise, because it definitely deserved it.
I long for something that I can represent, a flag to wave, to find those melodies.
The Way It Ends by Currents is almost on the same level as Polaris' album for me. The only reason I like it a little better is because I think this album has a better conceptual arc than Polaris's. I will always be a sucker for an album that feels like a concept album and talks about relevant emotions in a very powerful way. And I think that's exactly what this album does, and does so well. It talks about mental health and about coping with these struggles in a way that really personally touched me. Once again, similar to Polaris' album, this one flows very naturally. And with this one, I feel like there's not a single track that feels out of place. It feels like everything is placed really well here, and even though there are some songs that I don't love on here, I still think that I wouldn't take them out of the album because they add to the overall story. And I honestly can't resist the final nearly 5-track run of the final half of this album, from Origins to Better Days. This album is nearly pitch perfect there. But then we get into Better Days, where I think the album finally gets its redemptive message across, that even though we may feel like everything is ending around us, and that even mentally we're at the end of our ropes, we still need to look ahead for better days, which I think is a really good message, and the band says it far more poignantly than I am, to be honest. Once again, sound-wise, this band isn't necessarily doing anything super innovative for the metalcore scene, but I still think that they are using the sound to their advantage and making it sound interesting, which is very important. So yeah, more bands like this, please, in the metalcore scene. We need them very desperately.
Moonlight, you're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me.
The best pop album of the year, by far, Future Nostalgia by Dua Lipa. This album is here for a couple of reasons, but the main reason it's here is because it is just a load of fun. One of the most addicting albums of the year, one of my most listened to of the year by far. I absolutely loved this album, and I loved how it combined 80s pop with a sense of modern pop as well. And it combined these two together in a way that I think appeals to nearly anyone and everyone. Dua Lipa made pop fun again this year, and that's so important to me. Pop should have a sense of fun to it, a sense of energy, and this album has energy in abundance. When I first heard Physical, I just knew that this album was going to be a treat. I'd already loved the lead single Don't Start Now, but Physical was really the song that made me realize that this album could be great, and thankfully it was. Physical still stands tall as the best song on the album for me, with a chorus that just never fails to make me sing along. But you've also got other great tracks that do deserve recognition on here, like Levitating, which just has a wonderful classic 80s pop energy to it, feels very much so of that time, and it also feels timeless in a way. But then you've also got great songs on here that feel more like modern pop, but still with better production value and still with obvious influence from the 80s that make them sound even more interesting, like Break My Heart or Cool, which I think is a super underrated song on this album. This album through and through is just a clear example that Dua Lipa is one of the most promising pop artists of our generation. She is going to be making huge waves for the future if this is already what she's doing on her second album. I absolutely love this release, and I continue to turn back to it, and I'm sure I will for the very near future.
Alley in a black granddaddy rolling down old natty how nappy Matty as a black granddaddy all back no cap.
It's more coincidence than anything else that Run the Jewels' fourth album, RTG4, also ends up at the 4th place on my best albums of the year list. But, you know, this album did deserve to be this high because it is absolutely wonderful. Run the Jewels is always an artist that I have sort of casually been into, but I think on this album I finally really fully got into them, and because of that, I know I need to go back to their previous discography to finally fully appreciate what they've been going for on all their albums. They are a really consistent rap duo that are always doing really good things, and on this album, they continue to prove that they are some of the greatest rap artists out there. Lyrically, it's where Killer Mike shines. Undoubtedly, in a song like Walking in the Snow, there's a clear example of this, as Killer Mike talks about racism in scathing detail that feels very powerful and very relevant. And of course, he does this on a Word for the Firing Squad as well, which still leaves me with a very haunted feeling. This album knows how to talk about tough topics, and do it in a way that is uncomfortable, but also a way to where they're not alienating the listener too much. They're presenting them with these challenging topics, and they're really leaving it up to the listener as what they do with these challenging statements. And in that way, they're empowering the listener, which I really like, and which is something I think is really ingenious of Run the Jewels. And of course, the sense of fun the album has can't be denied. Even in the midst of serious topics, there's still a lot of songs on here that are just serious bangers and just work on that level as well. So this album is very multifaceted in that regard, and by far my favorite rap album of the year.
Shamika said I had potential.
I'm going to be keeping my discussion on this one fairly short because I still feel like my words cannot describe just what this album does and how well it works. Even though it's only at number 3, make no mistake, this is a superb album by Fiona Apple. She proves herself to be one of the best writers of our time, and the lyricism on this album is just mind-blowing. It's incredible to listen to, and she left no stone unturned in terms of the powerful messages here. There is great content after great content on here. For Her is still a song that leaves me shaken to my core with what it says and how it delves into its musicality with just these super percussive elements that still leave me, rightfully so, unsettled. But then you've also got songs that are just indicative of Fiona's raw talent and musicality, like Shamika, where she has just some of her best piano playing that I've ever heard from any artist. Or Under the Table, where Fiona Apple just lets her vocals go absolutely off the rails, and appropriately so. This is a wonderful album that I think deserves so much analysis and so much introspection. So go check it out for yourself.
I'm throwing caution. What's it gonna be? Tonight the winds are changing.
run of albums, with the exception of Wonderful Wonderful, which is pretty good. I feel like the Killers have finally found that album, that sound that could match up to their debut with Imploding the Mirage. While I still probably like the Killers' debut better, this album could take that spot in the future, because man, did this album work for me in almost every way possible. This album is just pure classic rock in every sense of the word. I absolutely love what the Killers do on this album and talking about spirituality, and with Brandon Flowers talking about his relationship with his wife in very touching ways. This is one of the most emotionally resonant rock albums I've heard in quite some time, and I just can't get enough of it. My Own Soul's Warning still impresses me with how it begins the album, with just this beautiful combination of synths and guitar work that just creates an atmosphere that is so resilient and so powerful and lifts me off my feet every time. And we've also got other great cuts on here. Caution is a classic Killers song that I wouldn't be surprised if it were compared along the likes of Mr. Brightside and songs like that in the future, because it does have that classic Killers flair. But then you've also got the deep cuts on here, like Lightning Fields, which is just a beautiful ode to Brandon Flowers' wife, with a chorus that feels endlessly epic and goes to new heights every time I hear it. And of course, you've even got the more laid-back songs like Dying Breed or Blowback that are still great and beautiful in their own way. This album is just wonderful and proves that rock is far from dead. Welcome back, The Killers. I hope you make an album like this in the future, because this is just excellent. Since Declaration came out back in April, it has been my #1 album, and it has never shifted from that spot. And as you can tell now, it still hasn't shifted. I mean, come on, it's Red. They're one of my favorite bands of all time, and they've never disappointed me. Even on their weakest album, Release the Panic, they still made a pretty solid album in that. And I feel that Declaration is just another superb release from Red. I absolutely love every choice this album makes, pretty much. It is Red's most intense album to date by far, and it might even be their darkest album to date, as they really delve into some uncomfortable issues on certain songs. The opening track, All For You, wastes no time in showing you this with some of the most uncomfortable lyrics that Red has penned to date, as well as Michael sounding like he's practically breaking his vocal cords in the chorus, which I absolutely loved. And then, of course, you've got an iconic Red song like Infidel, which feels like it would fit right on of Beauty and Rage, with the instantly memorable line, I Want to Hear You Scream, that is just so much fun to listen to. But of course, my favorite song on the album, as well as my favorite song of the year, is Cauterize. I mean, man, that chorus still gets to me every time. It is one of the most powerful choruses that Red has ever penned, one of their best choruses to date, in my opinion. And while I ranked the song at number 10 on my top 10 best Red songs, I think I might even rank it higher now. It's just continued to resonate with me throughout the year, and it's very relevant subject matter of the fact that we don't have to be alone in dealing with personal wounds, that we can turn to each other and we can turn to our faith in order to overcome deep intrinsic wounds. It's just a powerful message that only Red can do. The album has strings in abundance with the rock flair, and that's what I love about Red, is how they can combine so well the symphonic aspects of themselves with the hard rock aspects and bring a sound together that is wholly their own. I've never heard a band nail their sound quite like they do, and that is what makes me love this album so much. Red is a band that never fails me, and they still haven't. So yeah, that was my list of the top 20 best albums of 2020. What does your list look like? Let me know in the comments below. And once again, my name is James, and be on the lookout for my next 2 videos of list season. Now that we are done with music, we will be delving into the world of movies, and my first list will be the top 10 worst movies of 2020, so be on the lookout for that very soon. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.